Welcome to another edition of Around with Randall, your weekly podcast on making your nonprofit more effective for your community. And here is your host, the CEO and founder of Hallett Philanthropy, Randall Hallett.
It's a wonderful day here on this edition, and hopefully for every edition, of Around with Randall. When we see challenges inside our organization with personnel, with finding the right people, with adjusting to budgets, there's something new that, at least to me, is approaching the nonprofit space more regularly. And that's the idea of fractional employees. Today, we're going to discuss this concept of where fractional employees might sit, how it works, why it might be advantageous, why it might be a disadvantage. And then, as always, we hit the tactical. We'll end with 6 things that need to kind of be a part of the conversation if you're going to make fractional employees or fractional situations work. As we always try to, we start at the top, work our way down, and that's the big picture. So why is this appearing today in our world? Well, it's not immune to nonprofit space. We're seeing this in the for-profit space, and we're talking about usually smaller, more tightly knit groups of people, companies, employees. It's not, Ford Motor Company. They can hire who they need to, although they may use some of this. But it's more aligned with organizations trying to fill certain roles with a limited budget and limited personnel options. So we're seeing things like, and it started with maybe fractional CFOs into HR. In healthcare, we're seeing in small hospitals, fractional CMOs, maybe a rural-based healthcare organization or hospital doesn't need a full-time CMO. We're seeing this with also now moving into philanthropy with chief philanthropy officer, even gift officers. The great forces that are really pushing this in the nonprofit space as well as the for-profit space is that there is a need for expertise, for senior level experience, for talent that might be needed to execute certain things. And experienced personnel and professionals, they're hard to find. And as we've talked about a myriad of different episodes of Around with Randall, we talk about gift officers, short tenures, and they're hard to get, and we got to find the right people. How do we train them? Also, that technology has changed over the past 20 years the way many jobs are being done. And I'm not even talking about artificial intelligence, which I think will have a great effect on things like accounting and finance and things that are aligned with that, and then maybe moving into other areas of our organizations. But technology has enabled a distribution of work because it's reduced some level of need of people. And then at the same time, and the pandemic really pushed this, we don't need people sitting in an office. We can utilize talent from various places, the idea of remote work. This has pushed boards and CEOs and organizations to think about where they're most comfortable at really outsourcing some type of activity, or at least having a fractional employee. Nonprofits are experiencing the same shift as we see in the for-profit world, but there's 2 additional pressures. I think that the talent scarcity in the nonprofit world is significant. That fundraising leadership, nonprofit leadership, is not always known for being the highest paid. And as inflation and the economy has caused lots of different households and families to consider what they are doing with their finances, I think, and I truly believe, both anecdotally and if you look at it industry-wide, that we're seeing people being forced to consider leaving the nonprofit world to go into probably a for-profit position that pays more, which is putting an immense amount of pressure on the scarcity of talent. That it's harder to find chief philanthropy officers, chief executive officers, maybe you have an HR or a CFO or whatever the different areas. That experience is becoming challenging to find, and that we'll get to the second, financial constraints, that we are limited by what we can do. The other thing is that we're seeing shorter tenures, and we've talked about this from the CEO's perspective. We've talked about it with gift officers, CPOs. We're seeing it in these gaps beginning to become growing. So an organizational leader leaves, and all of a sudden, the gap to find their replacement is growing. So their tenure is getting shorter as permanent, and the gap to find the replacement is growing, which means we have these time frames that maybe we weren't used to, where internal people can't substantiate the work. We can't. We need leadership. We need guidance. We need expertise. We need talent, but we don't need it for incredibly long batches of time. So you could have small organizations, but you could also have the challenge. We'll get small organizations in a moment. Also, the issue of talent scarcity because of the way in which we're seeing people come and go more frequently. The second major accelerator when we talk about the nonprofit space or nonprofit sector is the idea of financial constraints, that our budgets are under siege. So we're talking about where this might be seen more often: smaller organizations, smaller hospitals, maybe smaller colleges, community-based nonprofits that I don't have big staffs. Maybe there's a regionalization of organizational structure. So this might actually be a larger one where maybe a university needs a fundraiser, a gift officer in a different part of the country because they have a lot of alums there, but they don't want someone going back and forth. Could a fractional person do that? Boards and governance parts of our organization, our leadership, our CEOs are being pressed from a financial perspective to have less expenses and more ROI. And these fractional employees, these fractional opportunities offer access to maybe experience that we couldn't afford or that we don't need full time, that fulfill a role but not bring us the full financial commitment. And so in the nonprofit space, we're seeing two major things to think about. Number one is this idea of talent scarcity. And number two is that the constraints of finance, in particular smaller organizations, are pressing us to think about creative solutions to get the right people to do the right jobs. And now we're to kind of where these particular opportunities lie in the nonprofit space. I think there's two areas that we can break this apart into. And we'll mention the first a couple of different ways and different times, but not focus on them. There are tactical parts of our organization, like finance, like HR, that are very regimented, that are more internalized, that may not require the full attention or time span of a person because the work is very pro forma. If you're the CFO, there are certain things you do and you are very repetitive in them. And that, by the way, makes you great at what you do. They're critical. HR is the same way. We have certain protocols and processes we need in place. That's one part. And I'll come back and mention that in a moment when we talk about tactical solutions. But that's not what I really want to spend my time talking about. Where the more interesting fractional opportunities lie is in the idea of a chief philanthropy officer or a major gift officer. And for the chief philanthropy officer, how do they fit into the organization? And these are going to become the tactical issues. We're talking about executing strategy, fundraising strategy, and about portfolio management and donor relations and board engagement, campaign issues and things going on. That's really hard to implement. The second is the gift officer. And I think there's actually two categories here. I think you can have an opportunity that's a lot easier for fractional employees with annual giving, meaning there is not the relationships that we need over time. There's a lot of more aligned with what the CFO and HR might do, very tactical things, whether it's reaching out to Libunts and Cybunts, whether it's providing mailing services or outreach or communication. You might have fractionalization that's along that line in kind of the communications piece. But the gift officer, the major gift officer, the plan giving officer, we have questions then that develop into the idea of campaign relationship building or major gift relationship building, which we know takes time, or that a leadership vacuum exists and we've got to figure out how to fill it as something in terms of not only the internal gift team, but relationships outside the organization. There are challenges with this. From the organizational perspective, if it's not done correctly, there's institutional continuity risk. These donor relations. I mean, if you're going through fractional short-term leadership or fractional opportunities too often, what you end up with is a situation where you're turning over gift officers almost like they were before, meaning the 18 to 19 months we see is kind of an industry, which depletes the thing we need the most, which is trust and continuity and consistency in relationships. So you have to be somewhat careful for the organization. Now, if it's a long-term fractional thing, meaning we're going to commit to this 50%, 40%, 30% employee for a decade and they have a smaller portfolio, that's not as much of a concern. I think there's also something about expectations. The ROI changes when you reduce the amount of time that a gift officer spends raising money, that we don't want unrealistic expectations, and that boards might look at, particularly a fractional CPO, well, they can deliver the same results. And I would find that challenging to figure out how to do, considering they're not there as often. I think the other thing is that major gift work or planned giving or any type of principal gifts or campaign gifts really require a more longer timeline for that relationship. And we're back to one of the challenges. Another thing that comes up internally for an organization, if it's not handled well, is kind of what I would think of as staff organization or staff hierarchy. There's unclear authority, possibly. How long are they here, unless they're going to be here for a long time? They're not here full time, but I am, so they don't know everything going on. There might be divided reporting lines depending on circumstances. The last thing that organizations may struggle with when we talk about fractional time is this idea of strategic depth. That fractional leaders may not have the full understanding because they're not around as long or as often or in person of the culture, of the politics, of the internal dynamics. These things limit effectiveness if the role isn't structured carefully. For the professional who is going to be the fractional employee, maybe this is something you've thought about, is that time allocation pressure is pretty great. Although you may think, well, I'm 50%, 40%, 30%, the organization may think, well, wait a minute, we need deliverables or outcomes, and this creates a real strong tension. Or you want to work only certain times, but they need you at other times, that tension then grows. So clarifying that, or maybe not clarifying it, can cause a great deal of friction in the organization and for the individual. Influences on that limitation is that normally fractional employees don't have as much authority as a full-time, probably justifiably so, but they have limitations, and that may add more time or strife or whatever it might be to the process of raising money or building relationships, because they have to check more often about, am I okay to do these things? Maybe they don't have full budget approval. Maybe they don't have full signing approval. They're just extra steps. There's also reputational risk that if the organization underperforms, a fractional employee can be blamed much more easily and quickly and removed for the systematic problems the organization has. So if you're that fractional employee, you want to make sure the organization is running pretty well, because you don't want to be the one that's blamed for the problems, even though they may not be your fault. The last thing is that for the individual or the fractional employee, we have emotional distance from donors, that if you're short-term or not around enough, then we can't build the relationships long-term that we want. And those shorter engagement windows can weaken those connections. So these are all things that talk about the structure, the organization, the challenges of these fractional roles, where they lie. What I want to spend the last 5 to 7 minutes on is really what are the 6 actual tactical solutions that will help you if you have this scenario. There's 2 biggies that I want to just start with generically, and I just mean from a big perspective. Is number one is that you have to do a hard assessment if this is necessary. The scarcity and talent that we were talking about have to really be agreed to, studied. The rationales have to be correct. This is not just, hey, let's go do this. Because if you do, you're going to get both the organizational and the kind of the fractional employee tension. that is going to prove to be problematic. So an honest assessment with appropriate feedback from internal employees, or maybe saying, you've given me 2 or 3 jobs now, I can't do all of them. That honest assessment is important. The second is, and this would be just basically true of anything, is that you can't have a conflict of interest. You can't try a fractional employee with a person who has a job in a competing part of the organization, or a fundraiser who has other fundraising responsibilities, and they might be compromised based upon the relationships they've developed over there that might be hurting you or hurting that other organization. So those are just 2 big things to think about: honest assessment, no conflict of interest. The tactical 6 things. Number 1 is you have to deeply, specifically define the scope of the work with immense precision. What is their decision-making authority? What is the time commitment? When, how much? What are the outcomes that you're expecting? What's the reporting structure? How are we going to monitor this? Fractional roles require sharper design than traditional jobs because there's more float, flexibility, unknowns, unless we define them well. So number 1 is, if you're going to lead yourself into fractional opportunities, either as the employee or the organization, you have to define all of these things incredibly accurately and get them in writing and part of the agreement so that everybody is working from the same baseline. Number 2 is to separate strategy and execution. So it's more likely that, particularly with gift officers, that we can have fractional employees with strategy, execution, and internal leadership than we do the relationship building process. And we're kind of back to that CFO, HR, internal process, because what we know is that they have very defined responsibilities, which means they can do some more specific things. Things like portfolio development in philanthropy would match that. Leadership, strategy, or building out communications, the annual fund process that I mentioned a few minutes ago. If you're doing this with gift officers, this gets a little more challenging because the relationship pieces are really important. One particular example that I mentioned just a few moments ago was the idea of maybe like a university or a mid-sized nonprofit needing someone fractionally in another part of the country where you have a bunch of donors. Well, if you maintain that for 5 to 10 years and it's a limited scale, I think that's awesome. But if coming and going into this interim leadership, into fractional employees is constant, it's going to be really hard to have this work if you keep turning over people in the relationship building process. So you're looking at more internal organizational structure type activities. Number 3 is you need to build some safeguards when it comes to continuity. Think about pairing up a fractional employee with a current employee so that they get some type of feel of culture, staff, rhythm, responsibilities, organizational structure, politics. And there has to be access to a shared, what I'll call, planning process, the CRM, because they may come and go, or there may not be the continuity. You got to know what's going on. You cannot just depend on the office talk, which we shouldn't do anyway. You got to track all these data points. Donors should feel as if the relationship with the organization is continuous, which means fractional employees, if we have to use them, particularly in the relationship process, have to make sure that they're documenting what they're doing and how that's affecting the relationship so that if anybody ever needs to pick that up, they can. Number 4 is to really define the performance measures. This goes along with the ethics that we talk about around we don't get paid by commission. So frankly, if all you measure is dollars raised, in particular on the fundraising side, you're going to get yourself in trouble. You need to measure things like, are we qualifying new people? Or if it's annual giving, are we sending out the right communication? Is our LIBUNT, SIBUNT percentages diminishing? Are we seeing more upgrades into types of gifts? Is there portfolio performance that we could look at? Number of visits? Is there opportunities to measure other things that aren't fundraising related, like coaching. If they're maybe a CPO and you have to help build up a younger staff member into their new or potential career development. The point is that all you use is dollars. You're going to really rue the day you did. Use other metrics. You want a strong ROI. We believe that. But in this situation, you need other metrics to really quantify what's happening. Number 5 is building out the strongest communication internally that you can. And I mean why we're doing this. So the staff, the leadership, the board all understands why this role exists and what authority they have to execute it and how these decisions were made in terms of rationale, scarcity of resources, expense, high talent level, right opportunity, however you want to put this. Transparency is really important because transparency reduces organizational friction in question. And if you establish that at the beginning, that means it probably will go much better in the execution of a fractional employee. The final thing is to treat fractional employees as transactional things or opportunities. So they might be rebuilding a program of a client that isn't fractional, but per se is doing some of this. And he was brought in specifically to rebuild a program, to rebuild it after there were some problems. You may need a fractional employee to help you prepare a campaign. This almost sounds like consulting, in that there's a very defined role and this is what you're going to be doing, or mentoring or stabilizing leadership. Fractional employees might be a great bridge to the organization figuring out what it wants to be and what it wants to do. The key here is to make it look translational in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. Not unless you can have the right circumstance, gift officer, another part of the country, tenure, engagement, that's different, but that's not what we normally see. Creating those roles and being really understanding that this isn't about the long term, it's about what we need now. These 6, the developing the scope of work with great precision, with separating the idea of strategy and execution, what are the things we need done that are maybe not relationship based, building in the donor safeguard. So if there is relationship based, that we have continuity and that we're tracking data, that we have realistic performance measures that are not just about money, that communicating internally the rationale, the reasons why, the outcomes we're seeking, what responsibilities there are. And finally, that we treat this as more transactional than long term in less unique circumstances. These 6 will help you do this correctly, both as the employee and also, maybe most importantly, as the organization. Fractional leadership in philanthropy, fractional work is not a passing trend. I think it's actually going to continue to deepen, which means that we have to figure out how to do this more effectively, to find the greatest talent and to deliver the best results. The real question isn't what's going to happen next in terms of whether this goes up or down in terms of usage or even a sense of normalcy. The real question is whether nonprofits will design them well enough to succeed. And in the end, that's doable if thought of in the right way. This gives you options to bring in high-level talent for less dollars that may deliver you more ROI, but you have to structure it in the right way to make it work not only for the organization, but for the fractional employee who you want to see succeed because they help you get to where you want to go. Don't forget to check out the blogs at hallettphilanthropy.com. I just happened to see, I didn't know I could do this on my website. I'm stunned by the thousands of RSS feeds that are sent out every week or twice a week on the blogs. 90-second reads, give you something to think about, not meant to change the world, but give you something to in the industry or of leadership or just about the lives that we live, about what we can think of and what we can do that might help you think about nonprofit work in your job or the work you do just a little bit differently. And if you'd like to reach out to me, it's podcast@hallettphilanthropy.com. We need philanthropy. We need nonprofit work. Because at the end of the day, this is the gap filler, as I always talk about, between for-profit enterprise that doesn't want to do certain things because it doesn't make any money, and government, which isn't that efficient. There's that hole in the middle. And we fill that hole with the organizations that we believe in their missions and also the work that we do every day. You matter in what you do every day. You may not see its impact directly at moment to moment, but you, if you're doing your job well, are affecting change and making a difference to the people. I'll bring it up from the backward side of my normal ending for people who are wondering what happened, because you're someone who makes things happen. Isn't that what we all want? Isn't that what we want, to wake up every morning thinking, I can make a difference today? And you are. People make things happen. People watch things happen. And those who wondered what happened, think about today in fractional employment, fractional work, either from the organizational or the individual perspective, as well as any other podcast, knowing that you are using these things that you're learning here to make your world better. And I congratulate you. And I thank you, because we need a better world, and philanthropy and nonprofit can be a huge part of leading us in that direction. So thank you for what you do. I'll look forward to seeing you right back here on the next edition of Around with Randall. Don't forget, make it a great day.